Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thank you so much for joining me today for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my watercolor painting process for 3 different sets of animal eyes. Aside from this, I'm going to be sharing 10 tips that I always make sure to apply myself and that have helped me improve my watercolor animal eye paintings. This is going to be a longer video than usual because I am actually not cutting anything out of my process for any of these sets of eyes. Of course, it is sped up. Painting all of these and moving back and forth between them took me somewhere around 3 hours. So I did speed it up, but nothing is cut out of my process. I think there are a couple of seconds missing from one of these, and that's because my camera died. But aside from that, everything is in here. One thing I do want to mention though is as I was painting these, I was actually switching back and forth between the different animal eyes. So I started with the first layer of paint in the husky eyes, then I moved on to the first layer of paint in the owl eyes, then I moved on to the first layer of paint in the cat eyes, and then I moved on to developing the second layer of paint all throughout the 3, and then the 4th, and so on. And I've talked about this in past watercolor videos, how I like jumping around from area to area as I am painting, because I need to allow a certain area to dry before going back in and adding further details or darkening values, etc. And this was super helpful for me to do with these eye studies, especially because when it comes to painting eyes, we really have to make sure that we're staying mindful of when we're going in wet on wet versus when we're going in wet on dry. In the iris of the eyes, for example, what you're watching me do right now with these owl eyes is I'm going in with a wet on wet effect. I pre-wetted everything with a very light translucent yellow, and then I am starting to go in and drop in some orange around the irises so that it can dissipate into the yellow, because watercolor pigment dissipates and blurs into and gradiates into the previous layer if the paper is wet. However, most of the times when you're painting something like the pupil, for example, not always, but usually you want that line around the pupil, the edges around the circle of the pupil, to be very sharp and clean. And if you want this to happen, you have to make sure that your paper has completely dried before going in and painting the pupil. Now, even though I was jumping back and forth between these animal eyes as I was painting them, I made sure to edit this video in such a way that I could provide timestamps for you so that you can just jump to a specific animal if you're just interested in learning how to paint those eyes. The timestamps are going to be down below for you in the description box of this video, along with all of the watercolor painting supplies that I used to create these studies today, in case you're interested in using them or checking them out for yourself. All right, you guys, before getting into the 10 tips, I want to send out a huge welcome to all of you new people just visiting my channel today for the very first time. I am super happy that you found me, and do consider subscribing because every single week I share new videos with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement for aspiring artists. And if you do subscribe, don't forget to click on that little notification bell so that YouTube can let you know whenever I publish a new video. Otherwise, you may or may not find out about it. I also want to send out a huge shout out to my entire Patreon community. I am so happy that it's growing. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for your support. And I am so looking forward to continuing to grow this innermost community and continuing to provide you guys with the most exclusive, in-depth, and helpful content. It's because of you guys on Patreon that I am able to continue buying these art supplies, to continue creating these videos and sharing them with everyone here on YouTube. So thank you for your support. It means the world. And if any of you guys out there are interested in getting immediate access to my most exclusive drawing and painting tutorials with complete audio commentary throughout the process, outline sketches, high quality reference pictures, and supply lists with specific paint colors, as well as live monthly Q&As and classes on art fundamentals, weekly sketchbook prompts sent to your inbox every single Monday that are designed to help you stay consistent and moving forward with your artistic knowledge, feedback from me on your work, and much more, make sure to check out the link to my Patreon site that I'm going to be leaving down below for you in the description box. All right, you guys, so I'm gonna get started with tip number 1, and this may sound a little bit redundant because this video is all about specifically painting eyes, but I'm just gonna go ahead and add this in anyway because I feel it's so important. And I feel a lot of beginners just getting started with either drawing or painting don't do these nearly enough. They wanna jump straight into very complex and complete compositions. And then they get very disappointed and frustrated because the outcome isn't really what they intended it to be. And this first tip is to make time to do isolated studies. Okay, make time to break complex compositions apart, because what you have to understand is that every single landscape, every single portrait, every single animal painting, every single still life painting, or whatever it is you're drawing or painting, is made up of so many different techniques, so many layers, so many things that you need to know about and study individually. And when you try to jump into the complete composition from not knowing anything at all, not even knowing enough about your medium or knowing enough about the subject, of course, if you're drawing something like a portrait or an animal, you have to make time to study about their proportions if you actually want it to look realistic. If you have to draw or paint something like a portrait, make time to study the individual facial features in and of themselves, because each individual facial feature is its own complex little structure that you need to understand and know about. And so I did this myself when I was first getting started with drawing and painting. I went in expecting a complete, perfect masterpiece, or wanting to jump straight to the canvas and expecting everything to turn out great. And then I got very frustrated because nothing was turning out the way that I envisioned it in my head. And so it wasn't until I started incorporating smaller studies, smaller explorations, breaking things apart into things that I could improve in isolation, that I started making tons of progress in my own artistic journey. Not to mention, these smaller studies and explorations allowed me to stay consistent, because obviously they're going to be a lot more fast to do than a complete composition. They allowed me to improve my confidence and my skill in order to be able to tackle more complex pieces with a lot more enjoyment and a lot more success. And they allow you to really focus in on a specific thing that you need to improve at, and improve your mastery over your medium and the knowledge of your specific subject on hand in a less overwhelming way. So no matter how you cut it, these kinds of studies are absolutely amazing. They're gonna take you far, and they're gonna make it a lot more likely that when you finally approach that complete animal painting, that complete landscape, that complete portrait, your outcome is gonna be a lot more effective. Okay, moving on to tip number 2, and this one is something that I talked about in my last video in which I was painting a Boston Terrier. I go much more into depth and actually give examples of photographs in that video, so make sure to go and check that one out if you haven't already. But this tip is gonna be to make sure you're stemming from an excellent reference photo. And this is especially important for artists out there who are looking to improve the level of realism in their work. In order to draw or paint something that is meant to look believable, it's very important that we either have something right in front of us that we can draw or paint from direct observation, or that we have a very good reference photo or a compilation of good reference photos or even videos. Unless we have a photographic memory or we have been studying a specific subject for years in all sorts of different scenarios, perspectives, angles, lightings, and all of these things, most likely we're not going to have enough information in our brains already that will enable us to make something look very realistic. We're going to forget certain details. And even though I do love using reference photos and actually taking my own whenever I can, setting up my own photo shoots and everything, it's never my intention to create a 100% complete replica of my reference photo or whatever it is I'm looking at. I am almost always changing the cropping, manipulating the color, bringing in certain things, taking out certain things, and using my artistic license really to bring in myself into the picture. As artists, if we are striving for higher levels of realism, it's very important to learn to observe, to really notice those subtleties that can really enhance the level of realism in our drawings or paintings, and take note of those little details that we may or may not want to include in our work. And it's very important to start making that distinction between drawing and painting something the way we think it looks like and drawing and painting something the way it actually looks like in real life. And if you're interested in knowing what exactly makes a good art reference photo when it comes to using it for painting animals, here are a few things that I always make sure that it has. I make sure that it has an excellent resolution so that I can open it in Photoshop or any sort of photo editing software and really zoom into the specific parts that I need to see more closely. I make sure that it's not blurry or pixelated. I always make sure that the photograph isn't over or underexposed and that it's not taken with flash. Flash is really the worst because it washes and flattens everything out to the point that we're not able to perceive different values and the different planes of whatever it is we're drawing or painting, and thus we're not able to properly recreate them, and it just makes everything much harder on us. Another thing that I always make sure my reference photo shows is a good pose and a good cropping. If the photo is large enough or has a lot of negative space around the subject, then no problem, because I can open it myself in Photoshop and take care of the cropping by myself. But if the photo is cropped in a very awkward way in which part of the body is cropped out, and especially when it comes to drawing or painting animals, we want to make sure that we are using animal poses or positions that really contribute to the message, interest, and visual impact of the piece, and really show the animal in its best light, so to speak, in a way that really makes that particular animal's innate characteristics really shine. I'm not really getting into compositional arrangement in this video because that's a whole beast of a topic in and of itself. But really think of the overall balance, the visual interest that you're trying to create in your artwork, and at the same time, making the animal shine. Oftentimes, I see beginners stem from photographs that don't really show the animal in its best light. Either it's in a very awkward position, or it was taken at an angle at which it doesn't really contribute to showing the form of the animal's body, or the animal is on some sort of weird cushion with a weird texture or a background that doesn't really make it pop. So really give thought to all of these things because they can really make or break your painting. Pertaining specifically to eyes, you want to make sure that your reference photo shows them completely, that you're able to zoom in and see tiny little details, little reflections, the shadows created by the top eyelid, that you're able to see the spherical nature of the eyeball so that you're then able to replicate those values that you're perceiving in your reference. Make sure that you pay attention to your photograph and develop a good variation in value and even color within the eyeballs, as well as always have those highlights, those areas of white highlights within the eyes, because those highlights really make the eye come to life. Those reflections and that spherical 3D effect that we create to the eye is really gonna make the painting come to life. By the way, if you have never tried to paint a sphere before, a three-dimensional sphere using watercolor, that is an excellent exercise that I would recommend to beginners in order to better create that three-dimensional illusion in the eyeball. Another important element of a realistic looking eye that a good reference photo is going to allow you to perceive is the tear line, which in many animals is very, very dark, and yet we do not want to create that cartoony outline effect at any point in time if we're looking for realism. Another thing is that there's often a little bit of highlight within the tear line because eyes are moist in nature, and many times that little moistness, that wetness from the eyeball kind of gets deposited on the tear line, and that creates a little bit of a highlight effect. As you can see right here, especially on the right eye of this cat, you can see the tear line right there and how I left a little tiny bit of white right there. In my journey towards improving both my human and animal eyes, I have discovered how important tear lines are in both. All right, you guys, so let's move on to tip number 3. This one is going to be to stay mindful of the brushes that you're using throughout your painting process. And the type and sizes of the brushes that you use are really going to depend on your own personal preference and way of working. But I can tell you for myself, for these eye studies, I used one quill brush in size 6, and I used 3 round brushes in sizes 14, 12, and 6. 6 was the smallest size of brush that I personally used for this one. If you've seen any of my past videos, you probably already know that I do like a certain level of realism, but I always like maintaining that painterly quality. And so I do, for the most part, like using the largest brush that I can get away with. Now, this said, as you saw in the beginning of this video, I am protecting my highlights within my eyes using masking fluid. So this means that even though the use of masking fluid definitely adds a couple of extra steps into the process, I don't have to work as hard throughout the actual painting process to protect my highlights and very carefully make my way around them. And this is possible even with a larger brush. The other area where I used masking fluid very loosely was in that upper section above the eyes to give the impression of fur and eyelashes. A lot of artists out there really like using very, very small detailing brushes, especially when it comes to creating something like highlights of eyes and tiny, tiny details. So it's really going to be a matter of practicing and discovering what specific brushes you personally like using more, which are more comfortable for you. But what's really important here when it comes to painting eyes and the areas around the eyes is that you make sure that you're switching brushes as you need to throughout the process. It's very useful to have larger brushes on hand so that you can do washes in larger areas. But for something like eyes especially, smaller brushes are super important as well. Moving on to tip number 4, and this goes hand in hand with something that I previously mentioned, is make sure that you are staying mindful of when you are using wet on wet techniques versus when you are using wet on dry techniques, and that you are allowing layers of paint to dry in between whenever you need to. To create my black looking color for these 3 paintings, I didn't use ready-made black. I used a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna or ultramarine blue and burnt umber. You guys that have been here in my channel for a while know that I really like avoiding the use of ready-made black like ivory black, Mars black, etc. And I like creating my own darks whenever possible. But the reason why I'm bringing this very dark color up right now is because I really wanted to make sure to stay mindful, especially when placing this very dark color, that the previous layers of paint were already dry. Especially when it came to developing those beautiful bright colors within the eyeballs. Imagine what would have happened if I had started painting in the pupil of the eyes, that very dark color in the central part of the eyes, while my first layer of paint was still wet. My entire black or very dark color would have dissipated and covered up my brighter color, and I didn't want that to happen. I wanted that dark area to stay very sharp. And so I did have to practice patience and make sure that I was allowing that previous layer of color to dry completely. And even though we don't have to be as careful, generally speaking, in the areas around the eyes, depending on the color of the animal itself and the texture of its skin or fur, of course, but even though we don't have to be as careful in when painting the fur and the areas around the eyes, it's very useful to think about when it's best to use wet on wet versus when it's better to use wet on dry. For me, it's very important to think about how, when it comes to painting with watercolor especially, less is more. And so I try to give the illusion of fur without actually having to paint in each little strand of hair. And I really like combining mostly wet on wet effects with a bit of wet on dry on top. Okay, moving on to tip number 5, and this also has to do with something that I previously mentioned, and this is remember the spherical nature of the eyeball. So once again, if you have never tried to paint a sphere, a normal, simple sphere with watercolor, this is something that I would highly, highly recommend. It's really going to help you when actually painting eyes. Now, of course, when it comes to eyes, we have eyelids. And so when it comes to painting both animal and human eyes, we have to make sure that we're creating that shadow effect created by the eyelid. But this exercise of painting a sphere is really going to help you because you are practicing your water control and practicing creating different translucencies and different values using watercolor to create that sphere look. Now, there are some animals that don't have sphere-like shaped eyes. Like the owl, for example, owl eyes have a very strange structure. But it's important to have in mind that it's that development of a variety of different values from very, very light and translucent to dark and saturated that are going to help create that illusion of three-dimensional form. And for the most part, this is really going to depend on the lighting situation. But for the most part, you can create a spherical-like effect by adding darker values around or in the outer parts of that sphere and lighter in the central parts of the sphere. But as I said, this is going to depend on the lighting situation on hand. Okay, moving on to tip number 6, and this is going to be to always, always, always make sure that you are keeping the highlights protected within the eyeball. As I mentioned before, it's these highlights that are going to make the eye come to life. They are going to make the eye look natural and moist. And this is why it's so important to make sure that you are planning them before you get started with your painting process and keeping them protected throughout with either using masking fluid or using a very tiny brush and working around them. And of course, there is always the option of adding them in at the end of the painting process using something like white gouache or a white paint pen, or even a white colored pencil. Of course, in my personal opinion, it always looks better when you actually keep the watercolor paper protected, but once again, this is just a matter of preference. Tip number 7 is going to be to start with a translucent bright yellow color within the eyes when appropriate. This is something that you saw me do for both the cat and the owl. And I really like creating a base color of yellow because it really adds a glow to the animal's eyes. I use them for both the owl and the cat because the subsequent colors that I would be adding on top of the yellow were colors that were analogous to yellow in the color wheel. For the owl, I added orange, which is next to yellow in the color wheel. And for the cat, I added green, which is next to yellow in the color wheel. And so it just made sense in those situations. For the husky, though, since the husky's eyes are blue, I didn't use yellow. Tip number 8 is to stay mindful of when you're creating harsh outlines or edges, especially if you're intending for your animal eyes to look more realistic. So as I was mentioning before, when I paint eyes, for the most part, I want my pupil to be very defined. And when it comes to painting animals, a lot of animals have that very dark kind of outline around their eyes, almost like an eyeliner effect. But almost everything else is pretty diffused and softened. And even when it comes to the tear line and that outline around the animal's eyes, you probably saw how in many of these paintings, I am going back in and softening some areas out in order for it not to look like an outline around my eye, because in realism, there are no outlines. So I really want to stay away from blocky, solid, heavy-looking shapes and stark-looking marks or lines. It's pretty easy to soften edges when we're working with watercolor. When the paint is still wet, you can simply go in and move it around a bit and create more of a natural-looking gradient by going in with a clean and only slightly dampened brush and simply pushing it outwards and distributing it along a wider area, or doing a little bit of lifting with your absorbent towel. And most likely, even after your watercolor paint has dried, you're going to be able to go back in and do a little bit of scrubbing with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush and lift a little bit of that pigment off from your paper, soften that edge a little bit. If you do use this little scrubbing technique though, make sure that you don't go overboard because you can damage and overwork your paper by accident. Even when it comes to going back into my painting to create a darker value in certain areas, because watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So I almost always go back in later and further darken certain areas. But even in those cases, I try to think of those tiny little areas as little abstract shapes, not as lines. All right, you guys, moving on to tip number 9, and this is to always, whenever it is you're painting an animal, really observe your reference image and have a good look at what direction the animal's hair in that specific part of its body is going in. So within its entire body, it has hairs that are shorter and longer and going off in different directions. And you want to make sure that you take note of this and that you're shifting the way that you're using your paintbrush in a way that makes sense with the particular area that you're painting. As I mentioned before, I don't try to paint in every single little strand of hair. I just move my paintbrush in organic ways. I dance around my watercolor paper and shift the way that I am using my paintbrush by either exerting more pressure on my paper with the belly of the bristles of my paintbrush, or touching very lightly with the tip, or moving it in certain directions, or shifting its angle. It depends. But as you can see, I am creating the illusion of fur without necessarily painting in every single little strand of hair, and thinking of these as more irregular organic shapes that I'm painting in. And all I am doing is shifting the way that I am using my paintbrush and really kind of observing my reference picture and changing it depending on the specific part of the dog that I am painting in. Because as I was mentioning before, both the length of the hair as well as the direction of the hair changes throughout its body. All right, you guys, and finally, tip number 10 is going to be to make sure that you're leaving any sort of eyelashes until the end. And this also applies to painting humans. You want to make sure that you're leaving the eyelashes until the very end, because eyelashes, for the most part, are one single brushstroke, and you want that brushstroke to be defined, whether it's very light and translucent or darker. Usually when I am painting a male, I like those eyelashes to be more transparent and lighter, and when I'm painting a female, they can be a bit darker because oftentimes females wear mascara. But whatever the case may be, you want to make sure that you're waiting until the end and that you're waiting for that paper to dry completely, because you don't want those lines for the eyelashes to bleed and blend into everything that you just created. In this particular case, I am doing a very kind of organic shape for my eyelashes because I added that masking fluid in, and I'm already going to be creating that illusion of eyelashes and little hairs around the eyes with my masking fluid. But my process is quite a bit different when I am painting a human. I always wait until the end and make sure that everything is completely bone dry, and I make sure that I am using a very small round paintbrush, something like a size 2 or smaller. And one note I want to make here is that even though those eyelashes could be considered lines created by one brushstroke, I always like kind of having in mind that there should be a sort of weight variation even within the eyelashes. There are certain eyelashes that should be lighter, certain eyelashes that should be darker, some are shorter, some are longer. And even within every single eyelash, I like making sure that there is a variation in weight, because if you think about it, eyelashes are thicker at their base and thinner at their end. And there is never a 100% consistent or continuous weight from one end of the line to the other end of the line. I personally find eyelashes quite tricky to do, especially when I'm painting humans. It's probably the phase of the painting process that I most fear. And one of the reasons why is because it's very easy to make them look unnatural and going overboard when it comes to the amount of eyelashes. It's also very easy to make the eyelashes overly curled, making the person look like a doll, or make them too long or too short. And there are just many things that can go wrong with painting eyelashes. So it's another thing that I really recommend doing studies of. and taking a good look at what eyelashes actually look like in real life. How they curl in different directions depending on the section of the eyelid that they're in, how they overlap in certain areas, how their lengths vary, and so on. All right, everyone, that is gonna do it for this video. I really hope that you found it helpful, that you found it inspiring. If you did, please make sure to give it a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I'm doing here on YouTube and helps more people get to know about my channel. And please do share this video with anyone that you feel would find it helpful. Let me know in the comment section below which set of eyes you like best and what animal eyes you're planning on practicing yourself. I'm going to be leaving a couple of watercolor painting videos right here for you to check out next, which I feel will be super helpful. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you very soon for another video, and have a beautiful rest of the day. Bye guys!